When we talk about America becoming a world power, we're referring to the events that lead to the United States becoming an overseas power. So we're talking particularly about the Spanish and Philippine-American Wars as really the beginning of this era. From 1898 to 1902, the Philippine-American War lasted longer than the Spanish-American War, but was associated with the Spanish-American War because the Philippines was a colony of Spain, as was Cuba. The Spanish-American War is usually associated with the United States conquest of the Spanish in Cuba and Puerto Rico. But the war also expanded into another war in the Philippines. So when we talk about America becoming a world power, we're talking about this moment of history when the United States becomes an overseas power, when it takes its first overseas territories, like the Philippines, like Hawaii, which was unrelated to the Spanish-American War. At least it was not directly related to that conflict. Puerto Rico, of course, becomes a territory. We see numerous islands in the Pacific that become territories of the United States at this time, and many of them remain territories of the United States today. It is in this moment where the 20th century, as an American century, a century where the United States becomes a world power, a century where the United States comes to dominate ultimately the global economy, when the United States has a military defense budget that is more than the next 10 countries combined, in the upwards of $700 billion. This era of time is really born in the Spanish and Philippine-American Wars, this period from 1898 to 1902, when the United States first becomes an overseas power. Historians have debated whether or not the United States, America, is inherently expansionist. The painting that you see is actually a painting from the Gilded Age period by John Gast called Manifest Destiny. And it's an interpretation depicting the American movement across the continent to the west. Some scholars have said that, like Andrew Stevenson, the author of the book Manifest Destiny, have argued that the United States America is inherently expansionist. That basically beginning in the colonial era with conflicts like in the Chesapeake, Bacon's Rebellion, or King Philip's War in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, that long before the independence of the United States, expansionist drives for land and resources, as well as these were driven as well by cultural factors, racial factors, and these types of things, drove American expansionism, encouraged Americans to fight with Native Americans, expand, ultimately seizing land and resources in a series of conflicts that continues for 2 centuries. Manifest Destiny, as you see depicted in this painting, what you're not seeing in this painting is the brutal conflicts that are fought during the continental expansion. So is America inherently expansionist? Some historians say yes. Other historians have said that while this was a significant period in Americans' continental expansion, some scholars, like Frederick Merck, for example, argue that the actual imperial impulse, the formation of an overseas empire, is nonetheless an aberration, a short-term thing the United States retreated from. The United States becomes an overseas world power with the Spanish and Philippine-American Wars of 1898 to 1902. When we think about this, we need to think about what forces drive decisions for war. There are external forces and there are internal forces. External forces are the things that pull a country into a conflict, and the internal forces are the things that push a country from inside to conflict, right? So if you were thinking about manifest destiny and some of the conflicts and the expansion of American settlers in their wars with Native Americans, you would find probably both of these. You would find the external pull, the desire for land. You might also have retaliation for attacks from both sides. External factors would be factors like national security, that a country says they have to take a certain action because if they don't take a certain action, it might threaten their security. They need to have military bases in places to protect the security and interests of the United States. An external pull could be an economic benefit, a desire for resources, whether it's land or oil. Those could be external factors that pull one to conflict. There could be humanitarian purposes. These could be things like a genocide, which would be an external pull factor. In some cases, these types of things can also be internal, of course. The internal push, we're talking about things like the people's will for war, right? When we look at the Spanish-American War, the people were really, really, really ramped up for war. And we'll talk about why. And that had a very significant effect on the decision of then President William McKinley to go to war with Spain. There can also be cultural factors, and these are internal factors. And cultural factors can be religious, they can be racial. When we look at the Gilded Age and you examine social Darwinism, in the social Darwinist sort of thinking, there's an inherent component of race, that certain people are most successful because of their race and gender, being white men, and this somehow justifies their right to kind of run and control the economy and the other peoples. Empires during the 1800s are driven by those factors as well, that there are people in the developing world that are racially inferior is what imperialists thought at this time, and that this justified their subjugation and conquest because they were deemed to be racially inferior. And so cultural factors like that, racism, patriarchy, gender, male dominance, those actually justify and drive conflicts as well. And we see that also in the Spanish and Philippine-American War. There can also be political ideals that drive war, conflicts to ensure that a government is a democratic government or something like that. Conflicts are justified by that sometimes. There have been American thinkers who have believed that that the United States' security was inherently linked to having American-friendly, democratic-like countries in the world. And this has justified conflicts in a number of cases. So what forces drive decisions for war? Thinking broadly, these could be external forces, humanitarian crises, incidents of a foreign attack, or something associated with a national security case. There could be a desire for land or resources external to the country. Of course, an economic desire could also be internal, the desire for an economic benefit. Internal factors, people's will in a democracy, cultural factors, these all are forces driving why a country goes to war. In the 1890s, the stage was really set for the United States to begin a development as an overseas power. The United States had completed its continental expansion. So by the 1890s, the Western expansion had ended. The continental expansion had ended. 4 transcontinental railroad lines, 5 by the turn of the 20th century, were now crisscrossing the country, connecting West Coast to East Coast. The brutal and destructive Native American conflicts, like the Great Sioux War, for example, those conflicts had been ended. Native American populations had been forced onto reservations, many in very, very poor conditions. Whether it was the Nez Perce Native Americans or Sioux Native Americans, Lakota, the Native American wars are over. The buffalo herds that once roamed the Midwest, the far west of the United States, the far Midwest of the United States, that numbered in the millions, had been almost completely annihilated, largely because they were considered a nuisance to the railroad industry at the time. So the United States had completed its continental expansion. And by the 1890, the United States is really set to become an overseas power. It was a burgeoning industrial powerhouse. The United States is moving quickly to be the largest producer of steel. And there was a real drive in the United States to seek out markets for this new economic base. The country, its industrial manufacturing output is on the rise. And the United States, its economy requires markets. And that encourages policymakers like Secretary of State John Hay to pursue policies that will allow the United States to access and trade with markets in the world, particularly in Asia. The events that kind of set the stage, that kind of put this period of time in terms of the conflicts that lead to the United States acquiring territories, whether it's the annexation of Puerto Rico, Hawaii, whether it's the influence in Cuba or the seizure of the Philippines, really the most probably significant first catalyst to justifying overseas military actions by the United States was a humanitarian crisis in Cuba. And this image, what you're looking at here, is an image from the Cuban Revolution during the 1890s. In 1895, there was a revolution against the Spanish who controlled Cuba. Cuba had been colonized and controlled by the Spanish. Of course, Cuba was one of the first islands visited by Columbus. After the 1895 revolt begins in Cuba, the Spanish brought in a general, General Weyler. They called him the Butcher because he was so brutal. And they had concentration camps. Concentration camps were used in many areas of the world during conflicts like this and revolts. And people were put into these camps, and the conditions were horrid. And you can see from this image, the young boy there is basically starving in these conditions. And this turned into a massive humanitarian crisis in Cuba. And it starts encouraging Americans to take a notice of this. And increasingly, as we become more and more aware of this crisis, Americans come to believe that they have a responsibility in Cuba. The immediate catalyst for war was the sinking of the USS Maine. The USS Maine was a warship, and you see it pictured here, and it was sent to Havana Harbor in Cuba. Basically, the reason it's sent there is there are American interests in Cuba. There are American citizens in Cuba. There are also economic interests in Cuba. And the ship was sent there basically to keep an eye on events, and should things deteriorate, this ship might be used to potentially aid in either evacuating Americans or in another way. So this ship, the USS Maine, is sent to Havana Harbor in Cuba, basically under the guise of protecting Americans. On February 15th, 1898, an explosion occurred that left 260 Americans dead. There were about 400 sailors on board the ship, and it's, as you see from here, this is the wreckage of the Maine. It's a massive explosion, and it leaves some 260 Americans dead as a result. Well, when it comes to the push factor, the internal factor in driving choices for war, news media can very much shape the attitude of the people. So the information that people consume, what it is, what conclusions it makes, these types of things can be a very significant factor in how Americans feel about certain events in their country or abroad. News media plays a role in shaping popular opinion. In some cases, if you look at the muckrakers, the journalists from the 1890s and the early period of the Progressive era in the early 20th century, muckrakers were investigative journalists, and they were sort of finding stories that Americans should know about to try to inspire reform. And in that sense, journalism and news media can be really, really important to promoting sort of positive and progressive reforms. However, if those in news media are not very careful to hold themselves to the highest standards of credibility, then it can also be it can potentially be a negative role in society, because the media that people consume will help to shape people's widespread opinions about events in the world and events at home, regardless of whether or not those events are accurate or true. So you look here at this newspaper headline. This is the New York Journal, and this is about the explosion of the USS Maine, and it says in the headline, "Crisis is at hand. Cabinet in sessions, growing belief in Spanish treachery." And you see over here, "Maine destroyed by an outside attack, naval officers believe." So here you have a case of yellow journalism. What is yellow journalism? Yellow journalism is the practice of dramatizing and sensationalizing the news to sell papers. At this time, newspapers, you had to sell papers to make profit. And so newspapers were looking for ways to market their newspapers to their readers. Just in the way that in the 24-hour cable news era of the 21st century, programs look at the metrics of who watches those programs, and they know the demographic of the people that watch those programs, and as a result of that, those types of programs, whether it's on a Fox News or an MSNBC, are often intentionally appealing to, rather than informing, they're appealing to the inherent biases and sort of interests of their audience. Because the more people that watch, the more money you make. It's a similar phenomenon here with yellow journalism. What yellow journalist papers did is they took stories and they found ways to craft the narrative of the story and the headlines so it was attractive and exciting and sold papers. It's an over-sensationalization, an over-dramatization of events with the goal and purpose being to sell papers. This was a large factor in building up the sentiments in the United States for war with Spain. Now, here you see the headline, and you might automatically say that, well, the Spanish just blew up an American ship, and over 200 American sailors died. So therefore, what's wrong with that? That's what the news should be doing. The only problem was with that is no one actually knew that to be the case at the time. It was actually up for discussion, and the truth historically is that the Maine was almost certainly not destroyed by an outside attack. It was probably an explosion internally of its boiler. And actually, divers dove on the Maine in the 60s, and that is almost certainly what happened by looking at the blast damage in the hull of the Maine. Likewise, Spain adamantly said, we did not do this. And so it's not fully known that this is the case, but when it happens, Newspapers grab onto this and they present the story that sells the best. And when you think, and there was also yellow journalism associated with the humanitarian crisis in Cuba. So the practice of appealing to the sort of desires of the readers, over dramatizing, over sensationalizing stories to sell papers, ultimately plays a major role in encouraging people to really demand war. It's the will of the people here. And people begin agitating for war to the point where President William McKinley goes to war. And he did it to a large degree because he believed that to not do it would basically, it would go against the popular will at the time as he saw it. And the United States, he would probably lose the next election. He would have rationalized. Last slide. Do cultural factors sometimes justify war and imperialism? And of course, the answer is yes. And when we look at the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War, and this is the cover of a really important work of history by the historian Kristen Hoganson, Fighting for American Manhood, How Gender Politics Provoked the Spanish and Philippine-American Wars. Hoganson argues that basically a fundamental driving force, this would be the push, this would be an internal force, for the United States to go to war with Spain and with the Philippines was because of a sense held by many Americans at the time, including Teddy Roosevelt, who wasn't president yet. He's not president until 1901, but he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, by an opinion that the country was becoming weak, that men were becoming less manly, and that somehow, in order to deal with this crisis of manliness in the United States should engage in a war with Spain and a war with the Philippines, where Roosevelt and others believed that young American men would encounter the savage, they would encounter the barbaric, they would encounter war, and that this, with what they believed was the American sort of refined sort of civilization, needed to encounter this type of activity to make Americans strong men. Roosevelt believed that white American men had become strong in America in part because of wars that were fought with Native Americans in the West. Well, now those wars are over. The country is becoming increasingly urban, and many figures like Roosevelt believed that this was leading to a weakening of the country's manliness, and they sought war. Theodore Roosevelt actually voluntarily went to Spain because he believed it was such an important activity for a man to go and fight in this war. And so cultural factors like gender and this sense that a lot of Americans had at the time, that the country was somehow becoming weaker and that these wars had to be undertaken to promote manliness. And there are a number of other scholars who have engaged in this type of narrative about some of the reasons for the causes of the Spanish and Philippine-American War. So yeah, cultural factors, racism, certainly justified a great deal of the pretty much all of the imperial wars, as well as the war in the Philippines, as well as the war with Spain and Cuba, as well as gender. These factors drive countries to come to go to war in some cases. So you have issues of economics, you have issues of national security, you have issues of humanitarian crises, you have cultural issues connected to race and to gender as well. And these are all factors in these conflicts that emerged first with the Spanish-American War in 1898, and then, of course, the Philippine-American War, which subsequently begins with the war with Spain.